Dear Richard, thank you very much for coming to see us for this journey from Nottingham to Austria.
From York.
From York. But you are an emeritus professor from Nottingham, I've heard.
No? Mine?
Nottinghamshire? No.
Emeritus really means I retired.
But you didn't retire at all.
Well, I am free of institutions. That is the important thing.
Yes, I've heard that since you seem to have retired, the burden of your work has increased tremendously.
Well, the wonderful thing about retirement is nobody has a right to expect anything from you. You never feel you're going to be judged again. No more research proposals, no more wondering whether your paper is going to be accepted by a journal, no more having to account for yourself. You just do what you want and you get paid a pension. It's wonderful.
So, and you can be rather political, and that's what I wanted to say when I said Nottinghamshire. Many of us know Robin Hood. So,
yes. I never met him.
You never met him. But your work seems to have a little bit of that.
I have used the Robin Hood measure of inequality once or twice.
Okay.
It's the amount of money that you'd have to transfer from the rich to the poor to get equality. That's the Robin Hood index.
Okay. So you have written a book, The Spirit Level, together with
Kate Pickett.
Kate Pickett, yes. I was wondering if I have the right name in my mind. And from that work, you gathered many of your work in this book. And so it was like Professor Schultheis said before, it was like a translation to the public, to the broad audience, to make accessible what the academia knows and what has another importance in our lives.
Yes.
And I'm very happy that you help us understanding why we have the problems we have to face. And I invite you to give it the talk.
Well, first an apology for not speaking any German. I can say Guten Morgen and Dankeschön, and that's all. Bitte. I want to start off by showing you the effects of inequality on children. When I talk about inequality, I mean the scale of income differences between rich and poor. And when I've shown you the effects in crude statistical terms, I want to get into explaining what's going on, why inequality has these effects. I like to start off with this picture because it shows how miserable we all are. Look at those faces there. These are people in the prime of life going to work. And every face there looks depressed, haggard, anxious. And in a way it shows that our modern societies are often very inefficient ways of producing well-being. And increasingly, many of us are thinking about the society, the kind of society which will produce sustainable well-being, thinking about the environmental issues. But what I really have to say to you is just this graph again and again and again, that the bigger the income difference is, the more inequality, the more problems you have. I was delighted when I found that graph on Google Images. I didn't draw it. I felt somebody's understood. I feel I've spent most of my career trying to get people to understand this relationship. But anyway, the issues that we have shown are related to inequality amongst children. Another set of issues related to inequality amongst adults are these. We looked at rich countries and also at American states. And all these issues are worse in countries or American states with bigger income differences between rich and poor. I'll take you quickly through a little of that data. But first, I think that many people are very surprised that income differences can have such a profound effect on so many different issues. and educational issues, physical health, life expectancy, mental health, drug taking, social mobility. They're all totally different issues, and yet I'm going to show you they're all related to inequality. That's a puzzle. But the reason why is these are all problems with social gradients, more common at the bottom of the social ladder, at the bottom of society, in the poorest areas. So although you have violence and ill health and drug abuse at the top of society, they're all more common at the bottom. And the first 20, 25 years of my career was really working on health inequalities, the tendency for health to be so much worse at the bottom than the top of society. And so in a way this comes out of that. I'm not a sociologist, I'm an epidemiologist, but I came into epidemiology from social sciences rather than medicine. So basically all I'm saying is that problems with those social gradients get worse when we increase the social status differences between us, when we increase the material differences between us. And one way in which the power of social position shows itself is in this little graph that comes from a World Bank study. They looked at children in different Indian castes. There were high caste children and low caste children. And they got them to do some little pen and paper tests. And they did them under two conditions. One, where they didn't know who was high caste and who was low caste. And they did equally well. And then another where they did know who was high and who was low. And suddenly a great big gap opens up. And those, what they're called stereotype threat experiments. And you can show the same sort of thing if you look at people by different social classes, by ethnicity, where one ethnic group is perhaps more predominant at the bottom of society. You can look at it by gender. Any little thing that makes you more aware that you belong to a group normally thought of as inferior seems to have powerful effects on performance. And think of what it's like for children in primary schools, not only with that little reminder in an experimental situation, but living it every day, knowing which children come from the rich areas and which from the poorer areas. The data we use to compare inequality in different countries, basically, like all our data, it's just downloaded from international sources. So ours comes from the UN Human Development Report, but it's the same data as in the World Bank study. And the measure we used, simply because it's available and people understand it, is how much richer are the top 20% in each country compared to the bottom 20%. You know, is that a small gap or is it a big gap? And you see on the left there, the more equal countries, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the top is getting 3.5 or 4 times as much as the bottom 20%. Austria, you see, when we collected this data from the UN, it's 4.8 times, that's the gap. But on the right-hand end, the more unequal countries, Australia, UK, Portugal, USA, Singapore, the gap is twice as big. Now people throughout history, from the French Revolution onwards, from before then, many of us have had an intuition that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. But now we can start to look at the data. And the data shows us how extraordinarily true that intuition about inequality is. We simply put together data on all those problems with social gradients for different countries and put them together in one index. So We got for each country life expectancy, children's maths and literacy scores from OECD, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, imprisonment, that's the proportion of population in prison, teenage birth rates, measures of trust, how much people feel they can trust each other in society, obesity rates, mental illness, which in the standard psychiatric classification includes drug and alcohol addiction as a mental illness, and some figures on social mobility. So we put all those into the same index, our index of health and social problems. And here it is related to that measure of inequality I've just shown you. So these are the figures we have on the bottom of this graph. So the more unequal countries on the right do worse on all those kinds of problems. Higher values are worse. So the USA does worse, then came Portugal, then UK, and at the other end, the more equal countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Japan. Austria, you see, is it will always be over that point, because when we collected this data, that's where Austria's inequality lay. Most countries have been getting more unequal recently. But if you look at exactly the same figures for each country, but this time related to gross national income per head, there's no relationship. Some of those countries are twice as rich as others, and it has no effect on all those kinds of issues. Now, most of those outcomes are adult outcomes. We were worried that people would say, well, they've just chosen problems that suit their argument. So we also looked at the UNICEF index, the United Nations Index of Child Well-being. It had 40 different components. So whether children can talk to their parents, whether there's bullying in school, what immunization rates are like, whether they have books at home, all that goes into the UNICEF index of child well-being. We did a paper in the British Medical Journal showing that its components were all related to inequality. We've more recently done a paper looking at changes in that index and showing that changes in child well-being in these rich countries are related to changes in the amount of inequality. But first, that UNICEF index of child well-being is not related to gross national income per head. You know, we all talk about child poverty as the issue. And people on one side of the political divide say, well, what we need is more economic growth. It'll lift everyone up. It doesn't make any difference in the rich countries. Norway, USA, twice as rich as Greece, Portugal, Israel, and it doesn't affect child well-being. But here it is in relation to that same measure of inequality that I showed you earlier. The more unequal countries with lower standards of child well-being. And up at the left there, the more equal ones with higher standards. Now let me just, as I say, we did look at changes over a 10-year period when UNICEF produced a new index, and they are statistically significantly related to changes in income inequality in each country. So Sweden, for instance, that's been having increases in inequality, has had a decline in their standard of child well-being. Now I want to just show you a few of the components of the some of the separate data. So this is dropping out of high school, data that you can get for American states, the proportion of children who don't complete high school related to inequality. Quite big differences there. This is bullying, how much children bully each other. We used a different measure in our book, but since then Frank Elgar in Canada has done several papers showing that, again, that bullying on a larger number of countries is related to inequality. The differences are very large. This is the percent of 11-year-olds who bullied others in the last 2 months. So at the bottom there, is 0 to 5%. So a lot of countries around 2 or 3% at the lowest level of bullying. And at the top, you've got 20%. So there are almost tenfold differences in the frequency of bullying, and a lot of that is related to inequality. This is the size of the differences in literacy scores in the PISA tests run internationally. The bigger the income differences, the bigger the differences in how well children do in those literacy tests. So there's a steep, where there are big income differences, there are steep social gradients in literacy scores. And that, of course, means that when you look at the average literacy score for each country, it's lower in more unequal countries. That's what this graph shows. The more unequal countries on the right have lower average levels of maths and literacy. This is teenage birth rates, always closely related to measures of relative deprivation within societies, and if you increase the differences between us, you find that teenage birth rates go up. It's births per 1,000 women in their teens, and you see at the bottom you've got about five women per 1,000 teenagers get pregnant, have babies. This is social mobility. I think we produced the first data showing that more unequal societies had less social mobility. But now there are a number of papers showing it. This is data from CORAC and the World Bank. And the more unequal countries on the right have less social mobility. The measure of social mobility is how important fathers' income is in determining children's income. Well, actually, it's sons' income. Because of the big changes in women's economic activity rates, it's fathers and sons, not mothers and daughters. And what this basically is showing, in more unequal countries, rich fathers tend to have rich sons and poor fathers have poor sons. This is a very important measure of social cohesion. This, I think, comes from the World Values Survey. It's the proportion of the population who agree that most people can be trusted. There's similar questions that show similar relationships, but if you look at, for instance, Putnam's work, his measures of people's involvement in community life, you find just the same thing. That community life is weaker, people trust each other less in more unequal societies. The differences are big. It's a percent of people who agree that most people can be trusted, and on the more unequal side, it drops to 15 or 20% of the population feeling they can trust others. But in the more equal countries, it rises to 60 or 65% feel they can trust others. If you have to walk home alone at night in a big city, you'll feel much safer doing it in one of the more equal societies. There is a paper which uses the European Values Survey, which shows that in more equal countries, people are more willing to help each other. There's a greater sense of solidarity. They're asked questions about whether they'd be willing to help people with disabilities, whether they'd be willing to help old people. We become less willing to help each other in more unequal societies and less trustful of each other. I've recently given some lectures in Mexico and in South Africa, and in both those countries there are appallingly big inequalities, much bigger than the differences in the countries I've been showing you. And what you see, and this is Mexico. Look at the bars on the windows and the bars around the outside of the house and the razor wire wound round. Or exactly the same thing in South Africa. I don't know if you can see on the top, there's some wires there. Those are electric wires. And there's some big dogs in there. And this notice, it's a poor photograph, I'm sorry, says armed response. So if you try and get in, you might be shot. So you move from a society in which people trust each other, are willing to help each other, where community life is strong. You move at the extreme to societies where people are afraid of each other and defend each other and themselves from each other. And as part of that, the homicide rates increase. People sometimes think that we invented all this data and these relationships, but actually the first studies showing that homicide rates were higher in more unequal countries came out in the 1970s. There are now about 60 papers on that relationship. The same is true of studies showing health is worse in more unequal societies. There are probably 300 papers in the peer-reviewed journals looking at that relationship. But look at the scale of the differences. Those red dots are American states, the more unequal ones at the top right, and these blue triangles are Canadian provinces. And the low inequality states and provinces have homicide rates that are, maybe 10 or 15 homicides per million population. It goes from 15 to 150. Tenfold differences in that measure of violence. This is imprisonment rates. It's a log scale up the side, so actually the figures go from about 40 prisoners per 100,000 up to 400. Again, a tenfold difference. An extraordinarily expensive and often cruel way of treating people. There's a film that's just been made around, it says it was inspired by our book, but it interviews someone in a prison in California. Somebody who was caught with 3 grams of cannabis. He was imprisoned for 26 years on the 3 strikes and you're out principle. And similarly, there were, when we were writing our book, about 300 people in prison for life for shoplifting, stealing things from shops. A barbaric way of treating people. Most of those differences is not more crime. Some of it is more crime. Most of it is more punitive sentencing, harsher sentencing. You get sent to prison for longer and for less in more unequal societies. We also show that the American states which retain the death penalty are more likely to be the more unequal states. We've recently put together figures on the age of criminal responsibility in different societies. And children are treated as adult criminals younger in more unequal societies. So again, more harsh. So what's going on behind this data? And I could go on showing you lots of these things. There are just too many of them. What I'm actually showing you, given that nearly all this stuff is a lot of it is behavioral, I'm showing you the psychosocial effects of inequality. It's not something that your poor housing or damp walls or whatever do to you physically. It's something that gets into your head about inequality. When we started to realize that psychosocial things, the biology of chronic stress, was an important contributor to the big differences in life expectancy between rich and poor in each of our societies, many psychologists did experiments all around the world in different universities, giving volunteers stressful things to do and then measuring in their saliva or their blood what was happening to their stress hormones. And in some of those experiments, they asked people to write about an unpleasant experience they've had. So your mind would be thinking about what an awful thing happened to you sometime. Other times, they'd get you to do little mathematical problems. Sometimes you'd have the additional embarrassment of reading out your marks at the end of it, so we'd know, who the silly ones were. Other times they'd video you while you did something, or ask you to give a little talk to the other people in the group. So lots of different stresses were used. And in this study, they looked at all those papers, 208 studies of that kind, and they asked what kind of stressful tasks most reliably push up cortisol levels. And the answer is it's tasks that include social evaluative threat, your worries about how you're seen and judged. They say threats to self-esteem or social status where other people can negatively judge your performance. That's what really makes us worried, tense. That's why people don't like public speaking. I used to be the most nervous person ever, and so nervous I couldn't see the audience and I couldn't read my notes and so on. I've got used to it slowly. But what we're most sensitive to are other people's judgments. We experience ourselves through each other's eyes. And one of the things that happens in more unequal societies, where some people are hugely important and other people just, they don't matter at all, is that we all become more worried about how we are seen and judged. This is from a paper published a couple of years ago. It looks at status anxiety across different income groups in more and less equal societies. So along the bottom, you've got people in the bottom 10% of the population, and it goes through the second 10%, third, fourth, until you get to the richest 10% at that end. So looking at the range of incomes in each society. Now, status anxiety in the more unequal societies is the top line. So right across the income groups, people in more unequal societies have more worries about status, how they're seen and judged. And at the bottom, the more equal societies, low inequality, less worries about that sort of thing. And we're slowly learning about our sensitivity to social status, partly from papers like that last one I showed you, partly by seeing the effects of inequality, but also through brain scans and so on, which I have identified parts of the brain which we share in common with many other animal species, areas of the brain which specialize in dealing with social status issues. And Sherry Johnson at Berkeley, who produced this paper, it's a remarkable piece of work. She goes through vast numbers of papers on different mental illnesses and personality disorders, and she shows that many of them are our sensitivities to these mental illnesses are compounded by how we respond to inequality. Do you feel inferior, put down? Do you accept your inferiority? Do you get depressed? Do you feel you're no good? Or are you all the time trying to fight your way up and stop that happening to you? Your life feeling like a battle to retain your self-respect and so on? Or do you feel that you have to show your all the time, show your successes, instead of being modest about your abilities, to flaunt them to other people? Or do you assume your superiority? Just think you're better than other people. And she goes through the evidence showing that. She thought, she wasn't interested in income inequality, she just thought every society had these status differences and that was roughly how it was. We've since shown that the mental illnesses she thought were related to this inequality are actually more common in more unequal societies. So measures of total mental illness, but also of depression, of narcissism, of schizophrenia, psychotic symptoms, and something I'll show you called self-enhancement, all increase in more unequal societies. So here's a graph showing depression is more common in more unequal American states. I may say that there are two responses to feeling more worried about how you're seen and judged. One is that you accept your inferiority. The other is you constantly trying to build yourself up in other people's eyes. So depression is people who are going under. Social life starts to feel an ordeal. You withdraw from social life. But the opposite response also happens. This is called self-enhancement, or you could call it self-aggrandizement or self-advertisement. People in these countries are asked, how do you think you compare with the average in your country? Do you think you're cleverer than most Austrians? Do you think you're more attractive? Do you feel you're better drivers than others? And this was an international team, and they find that people rate themselves more highly. They go in for this self-enhancement in more unequal countries. So you get the two opposite patterns. If you're worried about how you're seen and judged, some people flaunt their abilities and achievements, exaggerate them, and other people go under. And mental illness. Basically, what all this is about is simply, as human beings, we have two ways of coming together. And think of this in evolutionary terms. Think about monkey dominance hierarchies. We can either allocate goods in terms of power. The strongest baboon at the top gets the best share of the food. It feeds first. It's about power, coercion, privileged access to resources. Or, on the other hand, friendship, which is based on reciprocity, a recognition of each other's need. And of course, the gift is the symbol of friendship because it says, I recognize your need. I'm not going to compete with you for access to whatever it is. I share. And you see this in the fact that we still eat together. We don't dispute access to necessities. And that's the idea, and it's in the religious symbolism in terms of the communion. But how does it get into childhood? I think that the sensitive period in early life, which exists in so many different organisms, animals, it's always about providing a possibility of adaptation to the kind of world you find yourself born in, living in. And with children, it's about the differences in the quality of social relations. Am I going to have to live in a society where I will depend on trust, on reciprocity, on cooperation, where empathy is important? Or am I living in a society which you might call a dog-eat-dog society, in which we have to fend for ourselves, learn not to trust others because we're all rivals, not trusting each other? And we now know that there are really important epigenetic processes that underpin this adaptation. So in early life, depending on the quality of social relationships in the family, how much conflict there is, how much attention you do or don't get, you develop differently. When I say epigenetics, I mean ways in which the environment switches genes on and off. So your same genetic makeup makes you develop in different ways, different cognitive and emotional development in different kinds of societies. And just my two final slides. When I say people, if you feel endlessly worried about how you're seen and judged, you find social contact increasingly an ordeal, you withdraw from social life. That's why social community life is weaker in more unequal societies. This is Alan Bennett, who went to Oxford. He's an important literary figure in Britain. His parents worked in a butcher's shop. And he said, my parents put down most of their imagined shortcomings to not having been educated. Education was to them a passport to everything they lacked, to self-confidence, social ease, and above all, the ability to be like other people. Put simply, and they themselves would have put it, both my parents were shy, a shortcoming they thought of as an affliction, while at the same time enshrining it as a virtue. I assured them falsely, I wish he didn't say falsely because I don't think it is, I assured them that everybody felt much as they did, but that social ease was something that could and should be faked. You should pretend to be at ease with each other. Well, you can do that, Dad would say. You've been educated, adding how often he felt he had nothing to contribute. I'm boring, I think. I can't understand why anybody likes us. I wonder sometimes whether they really do. So you withdraw from social life because it all becomes more difficult. And at the extremes, this is my last slide, it becomes really an intolerable burden. In young people particularly, those feelings of being almost worthless. And of course, the solution is you drink more and you take drugs that make you feel you can relax with other people. And I think that is partly why drug abuse is more common in more unequal societies. So thank you. I'll end there.